author is a guy named Gabriel Adams. Gabe travels quite a bit. We have been everywhere that he traveled so that I could describe the hilly country, the flat country, that sort of thing, to try to make it a little more accurate and a little more readable. So by doing that, how many of you have seen the movie Forrest Gump? Most of you. It's a little Forrest Gumpian in the sense of Gabe meets important and famous people along the way. Now, I've tried to do that in a way that people don't say, oh, geez, that could never happen. I've tried to make it in kind of a normal way. And let me give you an example of that. I knew in the very beginning of the thought process that U.S. Grant would be involved, that John Brown would be involved. I knew my guy was going to be a lawyer. I had to have something I knew about. I couldn't write about geology, although an early version had a lot of geology in it, but the editor said, what does that have to do with legal injustice? And I said, well, not a whole lot, but I want to impress my professors that I actually learned something. So I had quite a bit. Anyway, so I knew that, and I knew some other things. I wanted it close to the Ohio River, because the Ohio River was, as you know, a crossing point, especially at Ripley, for the Underground Railroad. First chapters of the book are about the Underground Railroad, and so I needed it close to the Ohio River. My guy was going to be a lawyer, so I was kind of thinking county seat. I needed it close to Cincinnati for a couple of reasons. So I went to an Ohio map. I had no clue where my guy was going to live. So I literally went and got an Ohio map. We all know what a map is. My sons are going, what's a map? So anyway, so I get a map and I'm looking at it. Well, Georgetown, Ohio fit the bill. 9 miles from the Ohio River, county seat of Brown County, fairly close to Cincinnati. That's my town. What do I know about Georgetown, Ohio? Nothing. I'd never even heard of it before. So I Googled it. So now you see how modern I am. I go from a map to Google. It's really good. So I go Google Georgetown. Well, who is from Georgetown? U.S. Grant. U.S. Grant was born and raised there. So now I've got a way for my guy to meet, and when he meets U.S. Grant, Grant's family, good friends with Gabe's family. Now, Gabe didn't know Grant because Grant had already gone to West Point by the time Gabe was born, in fact, the same year. Gabe became our fourth son. We have 3 boys. And I'd come down from a day of writing and my wife would say, what did Gabe do today? So he became our fourth son. So when I started talking about Gabe being alive and, we did this and that with Gabe, he became alive to us. He became our fourth boy. Anyway, so Gabe knows when he finally does meet Grant, they put 2 and 2 together, and Grant, wow, I know your parents. They're great people. So they meet in a way that's not too phony. And then guess who lived with U.S. Grant's family for a couple of years up in northern Ohio? John Brown. So now I've got Grant and Brown living together, so they have a relationship, so I can bring in that relationship. So that's the way there was very serendipitous in the way the book worked in that way. But the point I'm making is I tried to get Gabe to meet these relatively important people, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, in a normal, almost odd way that is feasible. So you'd say, oh, that could happen, rather than that would never happen. And then what I'm able to do is I can take a true, like a speech, a Lincoln speech, as an example. Lincoln gave a speech in Peoria in 1855. This is before anybody knew who Abraham Lincoln was. He meets Gabe in 1855. So Gabe and Lincoln have a conversation using Lincoln's words from the Peoria speech. So not only am I trying to be accurate that the event occurred, but I'm using their actual words, either in dialogue or, while the event's going on, I can use these real people's actual words. And here's an historical tidbit. Back in the mid-1850s, stenographers were just coming into vogue. They were there. I don't know when stenographers actually started, but lots of stenographers were being sent out by newspapers like the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Chicago Tribune. They would send stenographers out to important events, Lincoln Douglas debate, John Brown's trial. And these people took down what happened verbatim. So we have transcripts of exactly what was said at Lincoln. You may wonder, how did they know what Lincoln said at the Lincoln Douglas debate? There were 5 transcribers there taking down every word, and then those transcribers compared notes to make sure that they were accurate. So we can be pretty sure that what is written about the Lincoln Douglas debates, what is written about John Brown's trial, is exactly what was said. So I took those words and made them into a conversation or made them into an event. So that the event itself I tried to make historically accurate, and the language is what was actually said at these events. So that's what I tried to do as the author. I wanted the reader to kind of, this actually happened, this was actually said. So that was my intent. So let me tell you a little bit about the Granville end of things. The Underground Railroad, as you know, came through Granville. And of course, my route on the Underground Railroad had to go through Granville. So we start in Ripley. They live in Georgetown. He takes them up to Georgetown, and then they start heading north. And of course, they get to Granville. Well, they were tired by the time they got to Granville, so they spent an extra day here because he kind of liked the town. So Gabe stays in Granville with his load of fugitive slaves that are hidden in the wagon, and they stay in Granville an extra day so they can recuperate. And they stay with Joseph and Samantha Linnell. Maybe Linnell, I don't know how to pronounce it. I think Linnell, but if anybody knows how they pronounced it, I wasn't there. I was close, not quite. By the way, just so you'll feel bad that or not feel bad, I'm kidding. Today is my 72nd birthday. So happy birthday. But so I'm not quite Linnell's age, but pretty close. Anyway, so they stay with Joseph and Samantha Linnell. The Linnells lived where Brindou is now. They were on the polo grounds where Brindou was. So Gabe and his load of fugitives end up at the Linnells' house, and Joseph Linnell takes Gabe out the next day and shows him around. Well, Granville College is still down here on Raccoon Creek, but they were ready to get up. They were talking about taking it to the top of the hill. So my guy goes around Granville, and as they're riding around, Linnell tells Gabe all about the Granville riot of 1836. So my editor said, "Why is this important?" I said, "Because it happened in Granville, and I want to put it in the book." So the Granville riot of 1836 is in the book, and you probably know more about it than I do, but they met at the Bancroft house, which is now right by the Mitchell Center. It's those 2 old buildings that are on either side of that entrance to Denison. And they met there. It was called the Hall of Freedom, and they had a rally. And it was the first state convention of the Abolitionist Society, the Ohio Abolitionist Society. And the anti-abolitionists came from far and wide to confront them. The anti-abolitionists gathered on Broadway, a couple hundred people. The abolitionists met at Bancroft Farm, and when they were done with their conference that day, there were 19 members of the Female Academy, the Granville Female Academy. And so these chivalrous men decided they better escort these women back because they had heard there's a group of people waiting for us on Broadway. So they literally did 4 abreast with the women in the middle walking down Pearl and then down Broadway. I think it was called a different street at that time, but I used Pearl, but I think it was Green Street at that time. But anyway, they came down Pearl, turned on Broadway, and were confronted by the abolitionists. There were rotten eggs thrown at them, and a great line of what was used in this is this was the throwing rotten eggs at people was the hen's argument against emancipation. So throwing rotten eggs. Anyway, now where did I get all this information? These books right here. I came to Granville, I bought all these books. So this historical society, and these are really good books. They are very good, accurate historical books. But that's where I got my information, from this historical society. And you know, that's what I did. Now I had some of them from when I was a student. I had gathered some of the books and I had given them to my parents for presents. So I had a lot of these books, or some of them. But some of these pamphlets are new and are excellent. So if you haven't read them, they're really, really good. Now you can read part of them in a book that just came out. I guess what I'm doing is giving a plug that these books are good. So if you are interested in Granville history, these are really good source. So that's where I got my information from, was from these books. So anyway, the riot broke up. There were some fisticuffs. Some people got thrown in the ditch. But it was all whiskey courage from the anti-abolitionists, and they broke up pretty easily. So nothing really happened, but it was a fun thing to put in the book. So the Underground Railroad comes through. I have the Granville riot in it. And then later in the book, I have a scene where a slave is captured. And back at that time, when under what was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, if a slave was caught, they had to be taken before a constable. The constable got paid more to return the slave to a purported owner than they did if they let the slave go free. So where was the incentive for a constable to let the person go free? Not much of one. They got paid more to let the person go back to. So even freed people hauled before a constable, the person was not allowed to testify, wasn't allowed to have any witnesses, wasn't allowed to defend him or herself, had a trial in front of a constable, got paid more for sending him back to a purported owner. Not a very fair judicial system. But in Granville, Ohio, in 1841, an enslaved person escaped, was caught, taken before the constable, but he had an abolitionist constable in Granville at the time. And the townspeople packed the courthouse. Samuel White was his attorney, who was an abolitionist at the time. They convinced the judge not to return the enslaved person to the owner, and they literally, in a mass of people, escorted this black person out of the courthouse and up to Canada. So Granville had that. Now, I didn't do that exact scene in the book. I took some liberties because there was also a similar thing happening in Oberlin that was a little different. Kind of merged those two. I added some other things. But the event that, as I describe it, would have occurred, could have occurred, and probably did occur. But it's an amalgamation of 2 or 3 actual events. So that's Granville in the book, and it's not the whole book, but it's a little bit of it. The other thing I guess I just wanted to mention about the book is, and it kind of goes back to why did I write it? I wrote the history so that people would learn the history. But the afterword is really why I wrote the book. And so I encourage you to read the afterword after you read the book. But let me read part to it and you'll see kind of where I'm going with this and why I wrote the book. This book ends in 1903. Why do we still have the lingering effects of slavery, overt racial discrimination, and systemic racism over 120 years later? Is it possible we're repeating history? And then I finish the afterword with why I'm glad all of you are here. Only by being knowledgeable about these issues and honestly and openly discussing them can we establish a third Reconstruction. Now, I'm not the one that coined the phrase, but the first Reconstruction was 1856 to 1875, after the Civil War till 1876. If I had time, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about what happened for the end of Reconstruction, but suffice to say, when Grant was president, he had the Army in the South to preserve the peace and to keep things like the Ku Klux Klan from interfering with voting and things like that. When Rutherford B. Hayes ran for president, he and Samuel Tilden tied in the Electoral College. And there were 20 electoral votes that were up for grabs. 3 states, this is starting to sound familiar. There were 3 states that were undecided, and they both sent a slate of electors to be counted, and a committee was formed to decide which electors are going to be counted. Hayes, and I've got to tell you another story. Hayes made a deal with those 3 southern states and said, if you give me your electoral votes, I will pull the Army out of the South. They give Hayes the 20 electoral votes. He pulls the Army out of the South. Reconstruction ends. Ku Klux Klan rises. Black people go from voting in the tens of thousands to the tens. One county, especially in South Carolina, had like 6,000 black votes in 1873, 74, 5 votes in 1880. All because of juror, I'll get it right yet, voter intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan. So the Reconstruction ends. So that's the first Reconstruction. The book goes into great depth about Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Second Reconstruction is the civil rights movement in the late 50s, after Brown versus Board of Education, the late 50s until maybe the early 70s. I believe, and it's not really in the book because my book ends at 1903, but I kind of believe that we're lost the fervor for the civil rights movement sometime in the 70s. We still did things, but then the Supreme Court has been chipping away since 1985 or so. They got rid of affirmative action. Schools can no longer use race as a criteria for admissions. I mean, they've chipped away at those sorts of things until we had what's called Shelby. And Shelby was the voting rights case where the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was probably the most significant thing that had occurred in the United States since the 15th Amendment was passed. Shelby, the Supreme Court said the southern states, the primary factor of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was that the South had to be, any voting change they made, any law change they made about voting had to be approved by a committee of the federal court system, really. The federal court system had a committee that had to approve these acts that were being passed by the South. And if they didn't if they didn't apply, if you will, to the Voting Rights Act of 1865, they weren't allowed. The Shelby case said South no longer needs that. There are no racial problems in the South anymore. They no longer need to be overseen. And one of the things I have a talk to lawyers that I give where I compare some of these cases from what more current with the 19th century case. And there was a 19th century case about the voting rights, and it's almost word for word verbatim. Now, I'm not saying the opinions were wrong. I'm just saying, does anybody in this room think that there's no racism in the South or in the North? Now, this isn't a Southern problem. This is an American problem. So, if you don't think there's any racism in the South, Shelby, probably makes some sense to you. If you think there might be some, maybe Shelby's not making as much sense. But Shelby is identical to a case that was written in the late 1900s, or excuse me, late 1800s. So that's what I do with this legal thing. But so the third Reconstruction is, I don't know when it is. The third Reconstruction may be going on now. Maybe we haven't started it. I don't know, but I don't think we're in it. So what I say is, we can establish a third Reconstruction. This book was written to provide knowledge. It is incumbent upon each of us to accept our role concerning racial injustice, confront it, and bring it to an end in America by exercising our right to vote and joining frank but painful conversations about race. We all have a drum to beat for justice. That's why I wrote the book, so that I could come and talk to a group like you. You can go out there and talk with your friends. Get your friends to vote. I don't care how they vote. I'm not here in any way, shape, or form to say vote one way or the other. I'm just saying vote. Get your friends to vote. Especially, and this is an aside, but women and minorities, there's no excuse for them not. I'm a white man. I've had the right to vote. My ancestors have had the right to vote forever. I have never had to worry about the right to vote. There are people in this room whose mothers were deprived of the right to vote. If I talked with if there were minorities in the class or in the group, they would have ancestors that weren't allowed to vote and were physically prevented from voting and were killed for voting. There's no excuse for people who have lost their ancestors have lost their lives and have fought so hard, like the women have fought to vote, not to vote now. I guess white men have an excuse because we never had to think about it. I can go on and on and on about poll taxes and the things that kept people from voting. I just don't have time, and there's just so much detail about that. I wanted to tell one quick story about Rutherford B. Hayes and come back to that. Some of you may know Rutherford B. Hayes went to a school up north, Gambier, or something like that, some town up north. And this is really quite offensive. This is truly an aside. And my wife goes, "Oh my God, get on point." This young lady here, who was my law clerk, went to Denison and was a superstar here, athletically, academically, a superstar. She lives on Kenyon Avenue. This is unheard of. So, Rutherford B. Hayes went to Kenyon. So I had a line in my book when they were talking about Rutherford B. Hayes selling his soul to get the presidency, and they're having this discussion about it. And Gabe says, "Well, he went to Kenyon because he couldn't get into Denison." My editor took that out. I was willing to sacrifice a few sales up in Gambier to have that line in there, but my editor took it out. So that's my Kenyon phrase. But anyway, I want to answer questions. This has been just a real pleasure to be here. I could go on and on. I got so many different things we can talk about. I like talking about the Supreme Court cases and comparing them, but also in the book, I go into some detail, especially on a fairly well-known case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which became the separate but equal doctrine and really set up Jim Crow and segregation for the next almost 100 years. Which is why we're having problems today. I mean, that's really the book. Why are we having problems today? Just like I read in the afterword. Because we've had 450 years of problems, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and we've had about 20 or 30 years of hope with the first and second Reconstructions. So if we want to know why we're having problems today, think history and kind of think, gee, well, I guess if I had been subjugated for 450 years and maybe had 20 years of good times or better times, maybe I'd be a little bit behind the times too. So that's kind of what the book does. That's the purpose of the book. I would encourage all of you, if you do read the book, talk with your friends. Join groups that talk about it. Pass the book along. We've got to start the third Reconstruction. This can't go on any longer. And it's unfortunately, it's becoming more prevalent till we start talking about it. Laws aren't going to change it. The judiciary isn't going to change it. People are going to change it. So, thank you. I'd answer any questions you have. Anybody awake? Well, let me give one as an example. and because it just came down in May, the South Carolina versus the some counties board of electors, the gerrymandering case. You may have read about it, but it was a gerrymandering case. Does anybody not know what gerrymandering is? So I can explain gerrymandering real quick. Okay, you know what gerrymandering is? Their legislature takes, how can we do whatever, we're going to make this thing look like a Rorschach block to make, and generally it's to make districts that are heavily black even heavier black, and districts that are mixed, take some of those blacks and put them in the black district, take some of the whites from another district and put them in this district, so that you have a majority white. For instance, in South Carolina, there are, I don't have the exact, I don't have my notes here, but I think there are 20 or 25 legislative seats in South Carolina. South Carolina has a majority black population. Blacks have 3 of the 20 seats because of gerrymandering. So in 1900, our Supreme Court said it doesn't, and it was a case involving Mississippi, and Mississippi and the Supreme Court admitted that they knew that their gerrymandering would affect minority voters in a negative way. We have the principle in the United States called one person, one vote. By gerrymandering, it's not, because they lose their clout, if you will. And so they don't really have the same vote as does a white person in where the white districts can then have more representation. So the Supreme Court in the 1900s, late 1800s, said as long as the state has a legitimate purpose for gerrymandering, it doesn't matter if they knew the result and the effect was going to affect the ability of blacks to have the voting power, the same as a white. As long as there's a legitimate purpose, then we're going to allow it. Fast forward to May of 2024, 4 or 5 months ago, Supreme Court came down with a case, South Carolina versus some county board of electors. In the opinion, Alito says, we know that this probably will affect the rights of minorities to vote, but the South Carolina legislature, which was about 75 or 80% white, because their decision was in their drafting of the gerrymandering borders, because the decision was a political decision and not a racial decision, we're going to say it's okay. Now, I don't know how you can separate a 75% white representation in the South Carolina legislature and say that a political decision is not a racial decision. But then they admitted, they had a guy testify from the head of the gerrymandering group, and he admitted, we knew that this was going to affect minority voting, but that's not why we did it. We did it because for political reasons. We wanted more Republicans in office. So we gerrymandered Republicans into the district. We gerrymandered more Democrats into a packed district, and we took Republicans and put them in so we could get more representation by Republicans. Now, you may all be Republicans. I'm not saying anything's wrong with it, but for our Supreme Court then to take the stand that because the legislature in South Carolina had a legitimate purpose that was not racial, they allowed it. Now, does that sound strangely familiar with the Mississippi case that I just quoted? The language is almost identical. And I have about 5 cases like that from the 1880s and stuff, comparing them. Voting rights cases, gerrymandering case. There was even an affirmative action case back in the 1800s where a municipality was trying to hire people with because they were black, because they had been underprivileged and underrepresented. So a municipality said, we're going to give them favoritism. We're going to go ahead, if they're qualified, If we have two people that are qualified and one's black and one's white, we're going to hire the black person. The Supreme Court said, nope, can't do that. Our current Supreme Court is saying, nope, can't do that. Again, I'm not saying they're wrong, because I could argue that they're right. I could argue that their opinions follow the intent of the writers of the 14th and 15th Amendments. I just think they're not looking at the moral side of things and the changes in circumstances and what it means and how we're thinking differently now than people thought in 1865. But it's not meaning, I don't mean to say the Supreme Court is making a bad decision. I think they're making a decision that's based on the way people thought in 1865, not the way people think in 2024. But that's because we don't have an activist constitution. Yes, sir.
So, what are your thoughts on in states where you have constitutional amendments passed by the citizens, and then the legislature comes in and shaves things off? Florida, for example, allowed people who are incarcerated to pay their debt, who are released now, to become voters after they were off probation. The legislature said, but they owe us money. So if you haven't paid all your legal debts, you know about that, then you don't get to vote.
The comment was, and the question was, in shorter form, only because for time, but I think I condense it. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. But the comment was that the electorate, in what state was it? Florida. The electorate in Florida said felons who finish their probation, pay their time debt to society, could get their voting rights back. The legislature said, not so fast. They'll get their voting rights back when they pay all the fines that are owed, and when they have done everything they're supposed to do on probation, including paying restitution and fines and things like that. Then they can get their rights back. It's a very long answer to that, but our Supreme Court says that's okay. The problem is the other impediments that get set up to prevent that person from paying their debt. Among them, over the history, and part of this is discussed in the book, when you look at the history, and I'm going to use blacks, but it's really any person of color, but blacks have been deprived for 450 years of the ability to job advancement, accumulation of wealth, and education. Things, I'll be honest, I take for granted. My father was a professor. I grew up in an affluent neighborhood. I didn't have to worry about education, accumulation of wealth, and advancement. But we've held blacks down for 450 years, have not allowed them. Back in the 1800s, when the land grant was going on, land grant colleges, Ohio State University, I have to choke to say that word, but Ohio State is a land grant just like Michigan State is. Who did they take the land from? Indigenous people. So they take land away from the minorities. Back in the Oklahoma land rush, how many blacks do you think got property in the Oklahoma Sooner time? 0. So, and the greatest way to accumulate wealth, at least in the United States, is land ownership. Well, if you've deprived blacks for 450 years of land ownership, and now we get to 2024, they haven't had that chance to accumulate wealth. They haven't had the chances for education. Affirmative action gets taken away. So we hold them back to some extent. We don't let them accumulate wealth, and then we expect them to pay their fines with a lower paying job because they still owe the money, and then before they can vote. So my answer is a long-winded one to it's constitutionally valid But there are things that then get set up, especially the voting rights, the suppression right. People, it sounds good. Well, why don't we have photo IDs? Well, because they make it very hard for certain people to get a photo ID. If you're an elderly Black woman living 15 miles away from the nearest DMV, where are you going to get a driver's license? You don't have a car. You don't need to drive. So you try to get a government ID, and that's in Columbus. And let's say the person's living in Toledo. The only place you can get a government issued ID is Columbus. How are you going to get there? So it sounds good on the surface. Let's require people to have a photo ID. Let's make sure we don't have any fraudulent voting. Although they don't have any proof of any fraudulent voting, but that's a different issue. Indiana had a case that came down fairly recently where they were not able to show in any election in the history of the state of Indiana any voter that had impersonated somebody else to vote. Not one. And yet they passed a law for voter ID in Indiana. Excuse me, I said Indiana, Wisconsin. Where's my whitewater guy here? So you put up impediments even when you pass a law that seems to make sense. Yeah, people, it makes sense. Yeah, a person should pay their debt. They should pay what they owe. But that's what used to happen with poll taxes. You had to pay $15 a year to vote. Oh, I'll tell you another story about it. You had to pay $15 a year to vote. Well, in 1868, Black people didn't have $15. Well, then what about white people? Well, have you heard the term grandfather clause? You know where it comes from? If your grandfather voted, you didn't have to pay a poll tax. You didn't have to do a literacy test. They used to make people recite the entire constitution of one of these states. And they used to put in the constitution an absolutely indecipherable paragraph or two that no one could ever remember. And then they would require somebody registering for the first time to recite the Mississippi Constitution that they had purposely put in several clauses that no one could ever decipher. So those people couldn't vote unless your grandfather voted. Well, how many grandfathers that were Black voted prior to 1876? Zero. So for years and years, if you had a grandfather that voted, you could vote without any poll tax, any literacy test, didn't have to guess how many beans were in a jelly bean jar, which actually happened. There was a test that where how many soap bubbles are in a bar of soap. And one of the worst ones, and it's a Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court said this is okay. The registrar, who was an elected official, therefore white, got to determine if the person was a person of character. So a white registrar a Black person could come into the white registrar could look at him and say, you don't appear to be a person of character. You can't vote. So the Supreme Court said, that's okay. So I don't know if that's a long answer to your question, but it's tough because some of these things sound good on the surface, such as let's pay the fines before you get to vote. But then we put up impediments to keep people from paying their fines, to keep them from voting. And most of the voter suppression things affect minorities. Just a fact. Questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry? That's my next book. The question is, can I speculate about what would have happened if Abraham Lincoln had not been assassinated? He was reelected. Boy, I tell you, I wish I could write a book like that, because I think what probably would have happened if you heard his if you've ever read his second inaugural address, I think that laid out what would have happened if he remained. He would have done everything he could to have brought the secessionist states back into the Union as quickly as possible. But there would have been more enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He would have had no problem, I don't think, leaving the Army in the South as long as he could. Now, Grant did. Grant left it in there until 1876. So even had Lincoln served another term, but at that time there were not term limits on presidents. If Lincoln had lived, he was a young man. Would he have served 3 or 4 terms? There was nothing to stop him from it. It wasn't until Franklin Delano Roosevelt served for the 4th term that they passed the amendment that limited it to 2. So would Lincoln have, he was, as I say, he was a young man when he was reelected. Would he have served 3 or 4 terms? And what would have happened to the United States? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would have taken a completely different viewpoint. He would have had those years to appoint members to the Supreme Court. Let's say he had 16 years. Let's just assume that Lincoln served 4 terms. He probably would have had the entire court named by him. Would that change? Would that have changed things in the late 1800s? Maybe. I think an argument could be made that you look at his second inaugural address, and that's the framework. And that would have gotten the Union back in the secessionist states back in the Union just as quickly as possible, reinstate everything that he could. But I think that he would have treated, by that time, and this really goes into some depth in the book, and I don't want to get into it too much, but Lincoln, by our terms today, was a white supremacist and a racist. He did not believe that he believed that blacks were inferior, that they could never live with whites, that they should be colonized, sent to Cuba, Haiti, somewhere, back to Libya. He was very much in favor of colonization or sending them back to other countries. He never believed at the early part, until about 1863, that whites and blacks could ever live together. He thought they were inferior. He wanted the Western states to be white. Most of the Western states, as they became states, this is what the Kansas stuff was. It's talked about a lot in the book. But Kansas wanted to be white. Illinois passed laws that forbid blacks from coming into Illinois. Indiana did the same. Ohio tried. So there were laws out there that were going to prevent blacks from even being in these areas. I think Lincoln would have challenged that. Because by the time Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, he had talked enough with Frederick Douglass and others that he became convinced that blacks were human beings. And here's a quick one. Lincoln passed what were called the Confiscation Acts during the Civil War, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. He passed what's called the Confiscation Acts. The Confiscation Acts said that the Army, Union Army, could confiscate property, Southern property, that was being used to help the Confederacy. Food, horses, cows, slaves. Lincoln signed 3 acts called the Confiscation Acts, calling slaves property. That was until the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, as you might know, did not free any slaves. It gave slaves the right to be free, and only in the secessionist states. So how many masters who weren't fighting in the Civil War down in Mississippi read the Emancipation Proclamation and went, gosh darn it, you're free. See you guys, it's been really nice knowing you, you're all free. Of course that didn't happen. The only way a slave was freed during the Civil War after the Emancipation Proclamation was if they managed to get behind Union lines. And because of the Emancipation Proclamation, not only were they then deemed free, they could then join the Army, which they couldn't do prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. So the most important thing about the Emancipation Proclamation was freed, escaping, mostly men, but even anybody could be used, it could enlist in the Army and could become a soldier and be armed, which was unheard of. In fact, there was a lot of resistance to that by the white soldiers, which is why they had black regiments. Most of you know, especially with the movie Glory, there were just black regiments. They weren't integrated. The Army wasn't integrated until World War II. So in Civil War, they were separate regiments. But the point is, Lincoln started changing his view. And when black soldiers proved their valor, and there's multiple battles where blacks led the charge, they were willing to lead the charge. And that's where that movie Glory comes in. That's a true story, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They led the charge in a lot of these things and were butchered. You can imagine Southern soldiers being shot at by a black escaped slave. If they caught him, they killed him. Surrendering black people, just shot down, murdered, executed. They weren't going to take them as prisoners. They shot them. So the Emancipation Proclamation also changed Lincoln's view. So its importance really is that Lincoln started thinking, oh, these aren't property. These are people. I didn't know that. I got to start thinking about this. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln started thinking, maybe we could live with them. And there's a theory. There's a really, really good book. I'll have to think of the name of it, by John Meacham. Came out recently. Not his Soul of America book, but another one. I can't think of the name. Something Constitution. The divided Constitution, the broken Constitution by John Meacham. But his theory is that Lincoln, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, it really was a different time, but right about that time, Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was fully engrossed in the original Constitution, which said slavery's okay. Slaves there was nothing to prevent slavery. They couldn't have the importation of slaves after 1808, but there was nothing in the Constitution that prevented slavery, and in fact, it allowed it. It also allowed what's called the fugitive slave provision of it. It treated slaves as a 3/5 person. So there were a lot of slave compromises, but they were slaves. These weren't human beings when the original Constitution was written. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which Lincoln is thinking about and actually trying to get Congress to pass while he was still alive, started him thinking, maybe our Constitution was wrong. Maybe this compromise Constitution was wrong, and our 14th and 15th, and the 13th Amendment, free the slaves, 14th Amendment, equal protection, due process, rights of birthright citizenship, things like that. But it's probably the most important amendment that was passed after the original 10. So Lincoln started thinking in terms of these people being humans, these people being viable products, ability to help our nation. And I think that's where he would have gone. But I don't know, and nobody knows. But I think there's enough that we kind of know where he would have headed, especially with his thought process. Oh, the other thing that Meacham says in his book that's really kind of interesting is that the Gettysburg Address was kind of his recognition that we were changing. And so he goes back to all men are created equal. We are here for the people, by the people, or of the people, by the people, and for the people. So in his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln starts formulating, we had it wrong in our Constitution. Let's get it right. And yes, sir. Oh, this was a judge friend of mine, wife. Read part of the book when it was in one of its early stages. And she just, I'll be honest, she fell in love with the book. And unbeknownst to me, she was a quilter. And she did this just on her own, thinking of who should be on a quilt. Obviously, the book cover has changed. But some of the figures there are in the book. In the kind of the second row down on the right is Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and U.S. Grant. Up at the top in the very middle is a guy named Albion Tourget, who was the guy that was the attorney in Plessy. And next to him is a black woman who represents the black my main black female protagonist in the book is obviously a black female, and that's what she thought she looked like. So that's my Jasmine, my thing. And then the second row down on the left, I was a Sigma Chi here, and Gabe goes to Miami University. I had to have him go somewhere at the time. He went to Miami at the year after Sigma Chi was founded at Miami, and he becomes a Sigma Chi. Oh, and all honor to his name and all that stuff. So he becomes a Sigma Chi. So she put the Sigma Chi stuff in, and she gave that to me as a present when I left the bench. When I retired from the bench, she presented that to me. And so it just.
All right, we can be here all night. We're having a great time, but I also know people, people Midwesterners don't like to get up. Particularly people who aren't. In the middle of a talk. So we thank you. He can linger, so please come and talk to him.
I have one thing to say. I knew Chris's father, graduate PhD at Michigan State, and he says in the book that this was a very good storyteller, and he was a very good professor. He was in paleobotany, and had some good interactions with him, but he was known for having contagious enthusiasm. He was a very, very good lecturer.
Can you inherit that?
Yeah.
I learned it from you.
All right, buy a book, Chris will sign books. And thank you for coming to come back in October. And
Thank you all.